Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gary Levinson. I'm the Artistic Director of the Chamber Music Society of Fort Worth, and it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you to our pre-concert talk. Regrettably, the last one of this season. It just feels like it's been such an incredible season, and it's flown by, but this is it, and we have a beautiful quartet concert to share with you. And I'll talk to you during the performance, actually, before and during the intermission, about next season, which is extremely exciting. But today we get to talk about Agócs, Janáček, and Dvořák with my dearest friend, someone you know and love, Dr. Laurie Shulman. Please help me welcome her.
Thank you, Gary, and good afternoon, everyone. Always a pleasure to return to Fort Worth and this wonderful series in this delightful auditorium. The Amarné Quartet are all friends, and this is a return visit for them to CMSFW, and we're absolutely delighted that they are presenting this program called Czechs Are Wild. In the interest of inclusivity and CMSFW being an equal opportunity presenter, they are opening with a work by a woman who is half American and half Hungarian. So, Czechs may be wild. We'll have plenty of Czech music later on in the program, but we're starting with a living composer named Kati Agócs. Before we introduce you to her music, I'd like to ask Gary to tell you a little bit about, especially the first half of this program. There are quite a few special effects that our string players are going to be using that are an outgrowth of the advances that Niccolò Paganini made to violin playing and violin technique in the first half of the 19th century. These techniques, which we now call extended techniques, advanced in the second half of the century as older violins, what we would now call Baroque violins, were reconfigured to produce a larger sound and to be able to sustain greater tension on the strings. In addition, strings which had been made from catgut in the 18th century started to be made of steel wire. So Gary, as our resident expert on violin and string technique, is just going to give you a little bit of an overview of these extended techniques in the Agócs and the Janáček.
So basically, the first thing to remember is the string quartet that you're going to hear for the next couple of hours is an outgrowth of the viol family. And the viol family during Bach's time, and really before that time, included something like 18 instruments, all the way from the piccolo violin that may have been this big to the octabass, which you have to stand on a ladder to play. So the evolution of the string instrument was to basically play on the strings and to finger on the fingerboard, which is why it's called the fingerboard. Well, I would say certainly for Laurie mentions Paganini, which is 18th century, but really through the 19th century and really at the end of the 19th century, composers and virtuosi decided they were going to push the limits of the instrument. So the special effects, one of the first ones were harmonics. Mozart used it, and that is produced by putting the finger on the string without pressing it all the way down. So you get an overtone, the same note 2 or 3 octaves higher. And then you have various other effects like ponticello, which is playing right on the bridge, or sul tasto, which is the opposite, playing far away from the bridge, which gives you sort of an airy sound. So when we talk about Kati Agócs and really about Janáček and all of the 20th and 21st century composers, and we met with one this morning, preview for the next couple of years, they love using not just the traditional ways of playing the instrument, but also the non-traditional ways. And certainly keyboard instruments, like with the George Crumb prepared piano, you get that as well in the late 20th and 21st century.
So with that as introduction, I want to walk you through a few short examples from Imprimatur, Kati Agócs' String Quartet No. 2. As you can see from your program page, it opens with a recitative, closes with a coda, and there are 5 sections in between that are played without pause. I believe the full length of the piece is approximately 15 minutes. But the purpose of what we're going to do over the next few minutes is just to give you a taste of her musical languages, and I use the plural advisedly. She opens with what we call a homophonic opening, which means that all 4 instruments are playing in the same rhythm, although generally in harmony. But then she is going to break away from something that to my ears sounds like the opening of the medieval chant, the Dies Irae, and she goes into something that is much wilder and more dissonant. She likens it to bell sounds, and by that, we think she means the overtone series that you hear in old-fashioned church bells, where you're getting multiple different sounds, even though there's theoretically just one pitch being sounded.
Yeah, exactly. If you strike a bell in different places, you get very different overtones, and I think that's what the effect that she achieves with the quartet.
May we hear example number 1, please? Very, very different musical languages just in that little snippet. All right, the next section we're going to listen to is a little bit of what she calls ostinato, which is the Latin or Italian cognate for the word obstinate, which means something that is repeated insistently and perhaps obsessively. It starts with a viola melody, and then you're going to hear the melody transfer to the second violin and then the first violin. The meters are very unusual in Kati Agócs's piece. This particular section goes from 7/4 to 5/4, and it's a very irregular pulse. Let's hear track 2, please. Could you hear how the underpinning in the bass is obsessive, and then that one melody keeps transferring from one player to another? It makes for very good visual theater when you're watching them, too, just keeping track of who is playing the principal melodic voice that's in the foreground.
It's really important for us to mention one of the great things about these pre-concert talks is we can drill down on some of the elements that make these pieces interesting. The reason I was drawn to this quartet is because Kati is able to have density and texture to her music. So, for example, you just heard an example where it was very smooth legato playing, but then there's density to the harmonies that dissipate into this legato playing. So one of the things that through the 14, 15 minutes of this quartet that's really exciting to watch and follow is how do these different textures change, evolve, and then oftentimes come back. Something that really I think you'll enjoy when you're listening to it.
My next example is from the section that she calls enraptured troping. There's two things going on here in that title. One is that the idea of rapture is associated with the ecstasy of religious inspiration. And troping is a medieval term that designates some sort of additional composition that is added to a traditional church chant. And you will read in her composer's note in the program how there are a number of connections to Catholic liturgy. Her father was apparently a scholar of Catholic liturgy, and she incorporates many quasi-sacred elements into her piece. The example will pitch the top two voices, that's the first and second violins, in a very sweet melodic duet, but the underpinning to them, which is going to be the two lower voices, the viola and the cello, are treated very, very differently. They're going to come across as more dissonant, and it's almost like there are two different conversations going on simultaneously. Here again, the meter is irregular. It's in 5/8 time. Track 3, please. It's a bit like a dinner party with 4 people, but 2 pair of people are having completely unrelated conversations.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, though they sound unrelated, they're quite related because the duet is in sixths, and it's one of the more stable intervals in the harmonic series. So this is a very well-sculpted composition. I'm thinking that, you heard the Beethoven quartets in the fall, and, Beethoven, one might say, passed his torch really onto Bartók, and this quartet has a little bit of feet in both, even though a lot of it is atonal music.
Her next segment has another quasi-religious title. It's called Meditation, and the subtitle is Shards of Light. And it's played with something called sultasto that I'm going to ask Gary to explain.
We mentioned it when I was talking about the viols. So what sultasto basically means very tastefully, but it refers to where one bows. So I probably should have the instrument in front of me, but you know what a violin looks like. We bow between the end of the fingerboard, the black part, and the bridge, which is the white part that holds the strings up. If you play sultasto, you're going to play pretty much over the fingerboard, which is the least tense place for the strings, and so you get a very airy sound. If you were to play ponticello, which we'll talk about a little bit later, that would be the closest to the bridge, which has the most tension and has a steely kind of a sound.
This next example from Meditation is in waltz rhythm, but it's really hard to discern that it's in waltz rhythm. May we hear track 4, please, Meditation. Next, we have a segment from the section she calls Wild Dance, which is not only the most overtly Hungarian, Bartókian of her sections, but also connects her part of the program to the Czechs Are Wild part of the program. What you will hear is a viola solo that alternates between 9/8 and 7/8 time, and he's going to be, the other 3 instruments are going to be using a double snap pizzicato, which is frequently called a Bartók pizzicato.
It basically asks the player to bounce the string off the fingerboard. So rather than pulling horizontally and having basically a guitar type of sound, what you're getting is a much more percussive sound, moving up and down as opposed to horizontally.
Let's listen. This is track 5, please. Does sound a lot like Bartók, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it's also folk instruments. That's why she's using it, because it's cymbalom and all the Hungarian, Romanian instruments, which I would say in the 19th century, very little classical music was written, but they started incorporating it in the 20th century.
Our last example from the Kati Agócs piece is from the Quodlibet, which is Latin for as you please. It is also something more associated with secular music, but clearly coming from medieval music. And you're going to hear sounds that are shimmering, that are sort of created by tremolando strings.
Yeah, which is a shimmering sound, as you said, but it's usually played at the tip, and it's a very quick series of strokes, which kind of, for me, they sound more like the wind and some sort of a nature sound rather than actual playing sounds.
And what you'll hear is the cello entering with music that is related to the ostinato music that she introduced earlier in the piece, but now it's in the bass line, and we have this lovely tonal duet sounding up above it. This is track 6, please. We move now to a very different composer who flourished in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Janáček, who was born, of course, in the 19th century, but he really came into his own in the last decade of his life. You can read in your program about the obsessive love that he developed for a woman 30 or so years his junior named Kamila Staslova. We'll have some pictures of her in a little bit. But first, I have to explain to you that this piece's subtitle, the Kreutzer Sonata, is not based on Beethoven except indirectly. In 1889, Tolstoy wrote a novella called The Kreutzer Sonata, which is a tale of jealousy, betrayal, and murder. A jealous husband believes that his wife, who is an excellent pianist and who played the Kreutzer Sonata with Beethoven's sonata with a very fine violinist, he developed this suspicion that she must be having an affair with the violinist. And his jealousy took on such mad proportions that eventually he murdered her. And the story takes place during a train journey where the murderer relates this to I guess, the narrator. So that is the background to this, and it's important that you understand it, but because it's sort of a narrative piece, and we will have some characters introduced in these examples a bit later. But my first example, which is from the opening movement, gives you a taste of Janáček's language. It's going to start with a very serious two-bar phrase that's going to be answered by something very jittery and skittery and nervous that is closely related to the rhythms of Czech language, which were an important musical source for Janáček. May we hear track 7, please? And that is what passes for a first theme in Janáček, but it's a really good introduction to the way he uses his musical material.
It's actually an incredible introduction in that he's basically telling you everything is going to take place for the next 4 movements. Essentially, it's like once upon the time, and then one instrument says, it's going to be bad. And they say, well, wait a minute, not yet. Once upon a time, I was saying, it's going to be bad.
But the second theme, and this does loosely have a sonata form structure, this first movement, is much sweeter. It has a yearning quality, and it lets us know the more feminine side, perhaps the unjustly accused female pianist's point of view. This is track 8, please. It's much happier, but I don't know, there's a dark side there.
There's always 2 things going on, and I think that one of the geniuses about this work is much like in the novella, at least 2 storylines are happening at the same time. And in the example you just heard, it's the viola that represents the jealous husband, and everybody's pretending it's all good, but as I said before, it's going to be bad.
So we move now to the second movement, which is sort of a rustic dance, but where there's going to be a lot of tempo changes that are hinting at the instability that is going on in the jealous husband's mind. Track 9, please. You could feel the push me, pull you aspect of that. He puts the brakes on, then he lets things go forward again with a little bit of more passion and impetuosity. He's at war within himself.
Well, he gives us a fake feeling of counterpoint. It sounds almost like there's a fugal subject about to come, and then he completely stops again, and there's such an instability about the story, and you get that in the music as well.
The next example is also from the second movement. We're going to hear more more rhythmic and harmonic instability. He's using a technique called sul ponticello, which means bowing near the bridge.
At the bridge, it's this very steely, kind of a cold sound where there's a lot of nature in this quartet.
It's very passionate and intense, this example, and it's as if there's an argument going on between the husband and the wife. That argument is going to continue in the third movement, from which we have drawn our next example. Now we have what's a canon. Think row, row, row your boat, and then somebody sings row, row, row your boat and comes in afterwards. So the two voices in direct, exact imitation, but the other two instruments, the middle voices are interrupting, and they're going to be playing again sul ponticello. And the first part, the canon, is the lady, and the other two instruments are the inner demons that are going on in the husband's mind.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one of the things that we have to remember, this is 20th century already, so film and film music has already come. So many times you'll notice that ponticello is used in a lot of film scores to denote something that's dangerous or something foreboding, and Janáček uses it really, really to the best possible way.
Could you hear the difference, and you get that sense of agitation when those inner two instruments are playing with that thing that sounds sort of scratchy?
Yeah, well, that's the ponticello. And remember that in the introduction, that's exactly what we talked about. You have the beginning, the three instruments saying, once upon a time, it was all good, and you know what happens.
Our next example is a violent interruption that happens in the middle of the third movement that pretty much lets you know she's done for. Let's listen to track 12, please. The last movement opens with a reprise of the opening movement, taking you back to sort of once upon a time, it was a kinder place. Then we hear a violin soliloquy, which is just unaccompanied violin for a short while. And our example is from the end of the violin solo to the takeoff, which is very busy background. You're going to hear a lot of counterpoint, and there's a driving acceleration in this music that is going to propel the entire quartet towards the end. Track 13, please.
Yeah, so this music is actually musical conversation. They're using the notes as a way for them to tell you what is going on in the story. How do we move it forward?
We believe that Camilla was, first of all, not to be confused with the newly crowned Queen of England, but we believe that their relationship was platonic. His love was unrequited, but they were apparently very affectionate with each other. And Janáček knew her husband, who had helped him during the First World War economically. But she was definitely his muse for the last 10 years of his life. And we are lucky that a lot of their letters have survived. The second quartet is actually called Intimate Letters. It is even more closely tied to Camilla Stoslova. We are now moving to post-intermission and our old friend Antonín Dvořák, arguably the greatest Czech composer of the entire Romantic era.
Certainly, thanks to Brahms, the most famous and one who spent a lot of his time here in the United States. But this quartet, I think Laurie will tell you, has a lot to do with him going back to what was then Czech, the Bohemia, I guess he would have called it, right?
Yeah.
And his love for nationalism, but him really missing his native land and missing Prague and missing beer.
Everybody knows, I think, that because of the New World Symphony and the so-called American Quartet, he did spend several years in the United States, but he loved his homeland, and when he finally got back to Bohemia, this quartet was just his outpouring of joy to be back in his native land. And you hear that immediately in the opening measures, which are birds singing, and we have a hint of a peasant dance. This is track 14, please. And so on from there. He has just introduced a lot of the material that is going to constitute the building blocks for his development section. His second theme, conforming with classical tradition, is very different in character. It's thought to be an expression of his imagery of the Bohemian fields in the countryside, which he loved very much. And this theme is important because it recurs in the last movement of the quartet. Track 15, please. Unlike the Kati Agócs segment we heard before, this is very clearly in a lilting waltz rhythm. Very easy to follow.
And it's interesting because I think this is, you could say that it's based on folk music, but it certainly isn't a folk melody. In fact, it's more of a feeling of what is it like to come back after you're homesick.
The slow movement is in a form and a mood that recurs frequently in Dvořák. It's called a dumka. And we are going to hear his Dumki trio next season. What it does is alternate fast and slow sections that are dramatically different in character. The main sections are in major mode. The example that I've chosen is one of the minor mode sections, and it's a duet with octave accompaniment in the other two instruments. The movement is movement as a whole is a cross between dumka and variations, but this contrast in moods, and Dvořák loves migrating between major mode and minor mode, are important to the character.
Let's talk about what a dumka is, because there is no real definition. The Slavs like to talk about sitting on a bench or in a cafe with one drink for 3 hours and being very satisfied about it. Now, that may sound like a very slow way of running your afternoon, but I think in many ways a dumka is a way to consider life and consider where you are in life and really sort of slow it down to take, just to figure out where you are and where you're going. So in many ways, it sounds to many people rather solemn and maybe even sad, but in fact, it's just a way of thinking, musically speaking.
It is also a narrative form that does allow you to take digressions. And while we were looking at that, thus and such happened. And that's what this example is all about, this minor mode interruption in the midst of what is otherwise primarily a movement in major mode. May we hear track 16, please? Could you hear the two instruments playing at an octave difference from one another? And the cello is giving you a sort of flowing arpeggiated accompaniment, while I think it's the second violin is playing pizzicato in the middle.
Right. It's also very unusual for Dvořák, because if you think of the dumka, for example, in the piano quintet and the other quartets, in the trio, the Dumki trio, most of it is generated and really run by the cello and sometimes the viola. But here the violin is the one that has the melody. Quite unusual for Dvořák.
So our last two examples are one each from the scherzo and the finale. The scherzo snippet, this is a peasant dance. Again, listen for the canon. It's in direct imitation, the second voice to the first. Number 17, please. finale to the Opus 106 quartet opens with a slow introduction, but the example that I have chosen is where it erupts into unbridled joy. He is just so happy to be home, and it is absolutely sure to put a smile on everyone's face in this auditorium because it is truly joyous music. Number 18, please. I would also like to point out that what we just heard is really, really difficult to play. It's like they're trying to outdo each other in how much ebullience they can express, but at the same time, they're supposed to be knit together as a quartet and be making musical sense.
Which is very much the Czech thing to do. You know, if any of you ever go to the Czech Republic now and you go out in the streets, you have a bunch of string players playing very difficult things, outdoing each other. I'm sure Dvořák was very familiar with that. Plus he played viola, and this is the kind of string writing that's just unbelievable joy. Being home and all is well.
And the Amornay are the kind of quartet who know how to bring both wildness and discipline as well as great musicality to their performances. It's a beautifully curated program, wonderful choice of repertoire, and we know you are going to enjoy it. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.